Good evening, friends. Welcome. Thrilled that you are here with us today for our Great Wednesday webinar, which this time will have a bit of a different feel. We are pre-recording this conversation because one of our guests is joining us from Jerusalem. And this is a great way for us to do this, to honor the time, and then to be able to get us all on here together. And so I want to introduce our guests today. And our guests today are Marc Brettler, who is the Bernice and Morton Lerner Distinguished Professor in Judaic Studies. Marc is a member of the American Academy for Jewish Research, a fellow at the Israel Institute of Advanced Studies. Let's see what else. Bernice and Morton Lerner Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University, the Dora Golding Professor of Biblical Studies Emeritus, and former chair of the Department of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis University. He has also taught at Yale University, Brown University, Wellesley College, and Middlebury College. There's a lot more to him than just this, but I'm not going to go through all of that right now. So I'll let you do some research. And then I also want to welcome back for a return visit to our webinar series, Amy Jill Levine, preferred AJ Levine. And so we are thrilled to have her back with us. AJ is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, and University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies Emerita, and Mary Jane Worthen Professor of Jewish Studies Emerita at Vanderbilt. She's also a part of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Countless publications, but they include The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus, Short Stories by Jesus, The Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi, 6 children's books with Sandy Sasso, one of my heroes, and also someone that we have interviewed, The Gospel of Luke, the Jewish Annotated New Testament, co-edited with our other guest here today, Marc Brettler, which is what we will be mostly talking about today. I could go on, but I encourage you to please do some work in learning more about these folks and the good work that they are doing in the world. And so I am going to now turn this over to the Reverend Neil Willard, rector of Palmer Memorial Episcopal Church here in Houston, and let this conversation begin. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Roger. And I want to thank our guests. Thank you so much for being. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you and to learn from you some things that I think are just really interesting, and that could be really helpful to people in the Christian world and to folks who are part of my congregation. And so we're in the season of Advent, and this is really my favorite season, even though sometimes the promise of what it's supposed to feel like for me as a Christian versus what it feels like when I'm actually living my life at this time of the year, there's a contrast there. But it marks the beginning of a new liturgical year for most Christians. And I want to come back to that later because I think it's really a wonderful time for Christians to ponder many of the things that you talk about and discuss in your book, The Bible With and Without Jesus, how Jews and Christians read the same stories differently. But I'd like to start by noting that the Christian liturgical year that just ended in November, which is part of a 3-year cycle of readings, it included readings from the book of Malachi that could be used near the beginning of that year and near the end of it. And in the past, when I have been in the pulpit on those occasions, I've taken an opportunity to talk about the canonical order of the books in the Bible, and how it makes, complete sense for the Christian Old Testament to end with the book of Malachi like a diving board, into the New Testament. And the big story, if you will, read that way makes complete sense. But I've also pointed out that the Hebrew Bible, or whatever other word you want to use there, and that's what I want to come back to, has a different ordering of the books in the library so that the big story takes the reader somewhere else. The emphasis is different. And so it's not unimportant how you arrange your library, right? So first of all, what terms can I Or should I use to refer to this ancient library that we call the Bible either as a whole in a non-Christian context or as the vast majority of it in a Christian context? So, I mean, am I a bad person if I, as a priest, use the term Old Testament in my own context? Can you talk to us about what these words mean? And people are always debating this or lecturing me or, don't use that.
Well, how about if I start and then Mark
Okay.
who typically finishes my sentences, will come
Right.
in. As I'm perfectly happy if Christians, particularly in a liturgical context, use the term Old Testament, because among other things, you're also going to use the term New Testament. So if you have a new, you ought to have something that's anterior to it. As long as you make sure that old is wonderful and fabulous and to be valued, and you get Social Security and you get seats on buses, and you can't be who you are without old. I'm speaking personally here.
Right.
Because if you use the term Old Testament, then I know you're talking about the Christian Bible part one. And I also know that you're talking about a canonical order that where part one ends with Malachi. And then you're absolutely right. You go from Malachi's prediction of the coming of Elijah the prophet for work of reconciliation. And then you can plop that right into the New Testament, where John the Baptist, at least in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, picks up the Elijah role. So, it's a promise fulfillment. I would much prefer, if speaking of the canon that's used in Jewish context, that we use the acronym Tanakh for Torah or Pentateuch, Nevi'im or prophets. Torah really means instruction, and Ketuvim, writings, and that ends not with Malachi. That's in the prophets, so that's tucked in the middle. It ends with Second Chronicles and indeed the Edict of King Cyrus of Persia, which means we're telling a different story. And I'm handing it over to Mark.
I very much appreciate the way in which you asked the question, in that you called the Bible a library. That's an incredibly important point, which many people miss. And in terms of a library, picking up on what AJ said, different people organize library books in different ways. I see your library behind you. It's very tidy. You seem to have things organized somewhat by color. All the things of the same series are together and so forth. And that's one way of organizing things, but there are many ways in which books can be organized, and organization really does matter. So to pick up on AJ, the Old Testament and the Tanakh are not really the same books.
Right.
They're not the same books for a variety of reasons. First of all, if we were to go out of your tradition to go to the Catholic tradition, then the Catholic Bible, the Old Testament, is larger than the Jewish Tanakh or the typical Protestant or Episcopalian Old Testament. So that needs to be considered. But order really does matter. Although I would point out that the one thing which both orders have in common is that the Torah really is the beginning, and it really is a recognition of how fundamental the Torah is in both the Jewish and in the Christian tradition. Now, I like the term Tanakh. I think it decenters people. And I think so many people think that they know what the Bible is about until they start reading it. And if we can start decentering people from the very beginning by using a new term for it, I think that's great. But certainly within a Christian tradition, Old Testament is perfectly appropriate. And I do not stone people who use the term Old Testament or stone people in general.
Yeah, because it can actually, what's meant as a kindness can sometimes be misleading if you use the wrong term in the wrong context, right? Or even so you didn't use the term Hebrew Bible. That's what generally true, but not specifically true in all contexts, right? Or what?
I'm just too much of a pedant to use Hebrew Bible, because part of it is narrow man, and it also really confuses people. So I've learned from a university setting that if you say you're teaching an introduction to Hebrew Bible, then the students think that you have to know Hebrew, which is not the case.
Okay.
So
I mean, the term actually doesn't work. So when I was in graduate school, which is at Duke, where Mark now teaches, I was told by my faculty to use the term Hebrew Bible because Jews found the term Old Testament insulting. And I was thinking, well, I didn't personally, and I had no Jewish faculty members, but so you listen to what your professors say. But Hebrew Bible is this basically Protestant default
Right.
which really means the Old Testament in the Protestant tradition, without the Apocrypha, the deuterocanonical material, which is also read by Anglicans.
Right. Yeah.
So it was this neuter term, which basically erased any distinction between the canon of the church and the canon of the synagogue, and it wound up being the Protestant canon anyway.
Right.
Nor do we use Greek Testament, right, or Greek Bible, because that's going to get confusing, since in Eastern Orthodoxy, the canon is not the Hebrew Bible at all. It's the Septuagint. It's the Greek translation. So Hebrew Bible winds up being a term of Protestant default that eliminates the Anglican canon, the Roman Catholic canon, and the Eastern Orthodox canons. Who needs this? So I like Mark's idea of this, the complication of it. And then we realize, as you pointed out initially, we're telling different stories. The Old Testament leads to the New Testament, promise fulfillment. Second Chronicles ends with the edict of King Cyrus of Persia saying to the Jews in Babylon, go home, which means it goes back. And it kind of circles around on itself, so that the Tanakh doesn't really have a teleology. It doesn't have a goal. You just go back and you do it again, and you try to get it better the next time. The analogy that I like to use for this is sports. Christianity is football, right? The kickoff is the Garden of Eden, and it's negative yardage up until the 50-yard line, which is the incarnation. And you're heading toward the book of Revelation, which is the end zone, which is the goal, and it's all linear. The synagogue is baseball. You kind of go into exile and then you go home. So if we recognize that we're playing with different teams with different rules on different fields with different equipment, then we don't have to say who got it right and who got it wrong. We just say, make sure that when you do your reading, you're playing by the rules of your team. And those teams being either the academic team, which is kind of composite, or the team of the church or the team of the synagogue.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that by saying that even though an editor gave my book the title, How to Read the Jewish Bible, I'm not thrilled with that term either, because that seems to suggest that this is a Bible only of Jews. Well, this clearly is something that we are sharing very broadly. And since I'm in Israel, I just want to pick up on what AJ just said about the importance of how the Tanakh ends. It ends with a return to the land. And again, one of the real differences between how Jews read the Bible and Christians read the Bible is land ends up being much more important within the Jewish reading. So that also needs to be taken into account.
You have used.
I want to add to that. I mean, and you can shut me up if you want, but this is the problem. So Mark and I, this is why we write very well together. It helps that we're on different continents. So he's usually in, 6 hours before I've woken up. That land thing, it's also at the end of the Torah, right? So Moses is overlooking the land, trying to get in, and then we rewind and we go back to Genesis. You had mentioned earlier the point about the liturgical year. So as Episcopalians, most of you are on the lectionary. And what happens here is we all read selectively. So that the lectionary typically omits the various promises made to the patriarchs about the land, because the church, when it got this lectionary going, wasn't concerned about who had the land. It was post-Constantine, they had it. So whereas Jews will liturgically hear that promise of the land in the Torah reading week after week after week, Christians almost don't hear it at all. And when they do, they kind of skip over it. So not only are we reading in different canonical order, as you pointed out, we're reading with different emphases, where the synagogue will emphasize the Torah. And when it comes to the Christian Old Testament, the emphasis there is going to be in the prophets, and most notably in Isaiah.
Well, that's actually a great segue, because, I'm looking at the readings for the second Sunday of Advent, and my heart is strangely warmed. So the first reading is going to be from Isaiah 11. A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. And this is all familiar language. It inspires me. It puts me in the mood of the season and that I'm supposed to be in. And it reminds me of something I've heard y'all talk about before. So when I read this, I think this is a helpful image for people in my context, that different people read different books or different parts of books with different font size. So when I'm looking at this Isaiah passage, this is enormously large font that I'm reading this in. And the things that you referred to, the passages about the land, that's like that's like little tiny font for me because I'm trying to track it, but I'm gravitating toward Isaiah. Can you say something about that? I thought the font size idea was something that could really that made it understandable for a lot of people, I think.
So it took a while to develop this image. The image I used to use when teaching was that different religious communities went to Staples and bought whiteout by the caseload. And that image just doesn't work anymore.
Right.
Because who uses whiteout now? But secondly, it really was a wrong image because we can't make things disappear from the biblical text. I mean, there were various efforts over time to get rid of books that were typically part of the canon. So, Luther did not especially like the Book of Esther, and if he had a choice, he would have jettisoned it. But really, since you're talking about liturgy and lectionaries, what we really do is we make readings better known or less well known by what we read or what we skip. And that is what the font size is connected to. Now, in some cases, since you brought up issues of land, Jews and Christians may have very different font sizes. In other cases, and I think Isaiah 11 is a very good example, I think this is also a very important text within Judaism as well. So I'm not going to debate whether one tradition has it in 40 points and one tradition has it in 36, and where it's bigger. I think in both traditions, it's certainly larger than the normal 12. But the other thing that each tradition does in its own way, and each tradition needs to respect the way in which the other tradition engages in this practice, is reinterpretation or interpretation. So that it is the case that Isaiah 11 is very important in both traditions, but the way in which it is interpreted differs from one tradition to the other. Where in Christianity, already from the earliest time, this is understood in reference to Jesus, while within Judaism, this is an expectation which we are still waiting to be fulfilled. So same text, different interpretation.
I have a question about the use of scripture with it, and this is I was thinking back to I'm from North Carolina. I went off to Wake Forest University where I had the privilege of taking Introduction to the New Testament with Charles Talbert, and so like a lot of college students in the religion department, I learned how to read biblical text closely, and there's ways you're supposed to use the biblical text in papers, right? And then I had this moment where I was like, I'm looking sort of at AJ, I had this like crisis moment where I'm thinking, I'm puzzled by Paul's use of scripture in his letters, and I'm trying to imagine Paul submitting one of his letters as a paper in a biblical studies class, and thinking, I don't know if he'd get a good grade on this. Like, he is really using this in a wild way, and he's using quotes from the Old Testament or just the Bible in his context so freely. And then later I come to the realization, I think that, well, gosh, a lot of people are doing this. Like, this is a normal thing to do. And then even in the early history of the Christian church, the church fathers often read scripture in a way that seems alien to a modern reader because they embrace a similar kind of imaginative freedom. And I'm wondering if y'all could talk about this kind of imaginative freedom in the larger context, even beyond the Christian world, because this is something that people don't understand or they don't know what to make of it.
What we tried to do in the Bible With and Without Jesus is take a kind of three-pronged approach to try to figure out what and we use the text from the Tanakh, the Old Testament, most commonly deployed in the New Testament. So that's how we figured out what we were going to look at. To figure out what those texts meant in their original historical context as best as we could determine that. And then looking at first century material, how they were read not only in the New Testament, but also how the Dead Sea Scrolls picked them up. If Josephus says something, or Philo says something, or some text that didn't make the canonical cut says something. And we can see there Jews from a variety of different schools of thought making the text relevant in their own lives, in particular the Pesher commentaries, the interpretations of Nahum or Habakkuk, for example, that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they're not looking at these things as historical artifacts. They're looking at these things as, this living, breathing text that requires interpretation. And then for the third prong, we jump forward to see how post-New Testament Jewish material, particularly in rabbinic sources, and some of them familiar with how Christians have used these quotes, are going back and saying, how might we look at them again? I had a colleague a number of years ago who taught Old Testament. I think he actually taught Hebrew Bible. And what he said was to his students, you need to park your Christianity at the door, because this is not a Christian text. Meanwhile, it's perfectly okay to bring in feminist interpretation or post-colonial interpretation or ideological criticism or reading from your own. The one thing you couldn't do was read like a Christian. And I just thought that was dumb. So what I would like to see in biblical education, whether it's in a seminary or in a university or in a church basement for that matter, or in your case in the fellowship hall, is to say, let's look at the history, but let's look at how this has been interpreted over time, and also to give people the freedom to say, here's what this text means to me at this particular moment, and then figure out what it means to other people in the room. And then you have a conversation with all these different interpretive modes.
Yeah, I think I would probably give failing grades to many biblical authors if they indeed handed in papers to me. And I think this really has to do, and this is an important point I'll build upon, AJ, this is not a criticism of the Bible at all. This just has to do with fundamentally different norms. I mean, so for example, I'll give a few examples. The Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, appears twice in the Bible, right? In Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. But they're different. Like, why can't you decide which is the correct version? Or, the very famous passage that people think is only from Isaiah, again, another passage which is understood about future times, where you have the wonderful verse, the second part of Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now that's wonderful. And there's a place right next to the United Nations. I think it's actually part of the United Nations that is called the Isaiah Wall and has these words inscribed on it. But why should it be called the Isaiah Wall? The exact same prophecy appears at the beginning of Micah chapter 4. Now here I don't care if Micah, I don't know how to say this, borrowed it, plagiarized it from Isaiah. Isaiah plagiarized it from Micah. Like, what do I need to bring one of them up in front of a disciplinary committee, or if they both took it from somewhere else? Yeah, I really don't know. These are just different norms. And what I try to do as a biblical scholar is to try to get students to understand these different norms. Because the method that I think both AJ and I predominantly use is to understand the text within its original historical context. So now going back to your question about Paul, what I would do is I would have the students read some Dead Sea Scrolls, and they would see that the Dead Sea Scrolls engage in interpretive methods which are really very similar to what Paul uses, although, of course, I've inverted the chronology. And I'm not saying that Paul is copying from the Dead Sea Scrolls in this particular case, but I am saying that Paul is using the Jewish interpretive norms, which are normal for that period, and you have to take that into account in order to better understand Paul. And similarly, I would try to introduce some students to rabbinic modes of interpretation, which often take texts wildly out of context. So here I'll just give you a single example and then I'll be quiet. Amos chapter 5, verse 2. And then I'll read the Hebrew, then I'll read the NRSV. Nafla lo tosif betulat Yisrael. I'll just read that part. NRSV, fallen no more to rise is made in Israel. Well, the rabbis, for whom Israel meant all of Israel and not merely the northern kingdom, which was its meaning in Amos, found this to be a very upsetting notion. So with tremendous violence to the syntax of this verse, they read it as nafla lo, tosif kum betulat Yisrael, fallen, oh no, will rise again, made in Israel. Now they surely knew that that is not supportable in terms of biblical syntax, but nevertheless, for a variety of reasons, they read this text in this very highly creative fashion. So we must not put our norms or the norms of any excellent college professor you had in exegesis course back into either what we should expect the rabbis to do or what we should expect Paul or other New Testament authors to do, because there really were different norms. And also because both the rabbis and the New Testament scholars and the New Testament authors, excuse me, were not treating the Old Testament or the Tanakh as a normal text. It was a text which was extra full of meaning. And all these Jewish groups tried to understand this fullness of meaning. And if you tried to do that in a Hebrew Bible, Old Testament or New Testament course, your professor would say, you are over reading the text. You are reading into the text.
Right.
But that is precisely what ancient people did because of a different theological understanding of what the Bible actually is.
One of the things that I have really learned from reading words that y'all have written together and conversations that y'all have had is like in sort of in my world, an invitation for people who might be a little more conservative Christian to see, multiple interpretations of a text or the same story at different points in time or or multiple ones at the same point in time. But then also on the other end, which is just as important, or maybe especially more so in the corner of the room in which I often find myself standing, which, as you said earlier, to allow more liberal Christians to see that, and which might come more easily, but to say also it's okay to use your imagination and your point of view, your faith point of view, to read through a Christian lens, all of these different texts as well. And I think that's actually a real gift that actually you have given many people in my corner of the room. It's sort of like when I went to Wake Forest, my first college class was Hebrew at 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm not even sure why I signed up for that. And it was a small class, and an Episcopal priest taught it. It was the first Episcopal priest I'd ever met. And then like to go into his office was like, I thought, is he Indiana Jones? I mean, he's like the archaeologist and does all that, but he really opened up all of that. It was like opening a door onto a much larger universe that did not diminish the Bible for me. It made it more wondrous. And I felt it just gave me a different perspective. And I feel like a lot of the conversations that you're having with people around these things I hope is doing the same thing, because that's certainly what how I react to it.
I just say, we try.
Okay.
And therefore I'll say the most important word in the title of the book is the word and.
Yeah.
And at some point, somebody in production for the book made a mistake, and the book was suddenly titled The Bible with or Without Jesus. And we both freaked out.
That's a very different conversation.
What this book is really about, and your observation picks up on that, is the possibility of multiple interpretations. Now, each person may have one that she or he favors within their religious group and religious tradition. We're not trying to take that away from anybody, right. But we really want to encourage people to sympathetically understand that there's an and here. There are many possible interpretations.
Another thing, you've touched on this a little bit, but again, especially in my context, so let's set aside the the appendix to the Bible called the New Testament and look at the first part from the Christian perspective, to encourage people that I often talk to see how stories or events in history or whatever are reinterpreted within the Old Testament itself. And I think that is sometimes revelatory for people to see that in action. They often read it in isolation, so they don't see that, oh, this is being reinterpreted. And it could be in different books, or it could be in the Psalms and that kind of thing. And then there's a very specific part, I guess, of that larger idea that I think I've heard you, Mark, refer to as revelatory exegesis. Could you explain? That's an elegant phrase. What does it mean, and what would be an example of revelatory exegesis?
AJ, was it my term or your term? I think it's your term.
I'm not sure whose term it is, but I like it.
Okay.
I'm still stuck on thinking about the New Testament as an appendix, because I don't like that model. An appendix is something that
I know. I
clears
was
up and you want to have it removed.
Correct. I appreciate that.
So
I wouldn't use it either.
Yeah, no.
I was trying to say the largest set of pages within the Christian Bible. If you limit the discussion just to how something's being reinterpreted within that.
If you look at a text through a particular theological lens, you're going to see things there that you would not see if you didn't have that lens. So you use like even the image of eyeglasses, right? So I can barely see you right now. Terrible eyesight. So if you look through Christian lenses, suddenly something in that ancient text will be revealed to you, and you will see the presence of Jesus there that you did not realize had been there before. It's not as if Paul, good Pharisee, did not know his stuff. But in light of his experience on the Damascus Road, now he's going to look again, and stuff in effect seems revealed to him, because now he's got those lenses on and he can say, oh, it's here and it's here and it's here. And he can come up with different explanations of text that would not have been read quite that same way before. So cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree, which is, the idea of Deuteronomy. It's you take them down, right? Because you don't want that body hanging up there. And Paul says, oh, it's the curse of the law. And he develops this entire view of how Torah functions for Gentiles underneath that. That would be for Paul revelatory. Other Jews would have said, not so much. We don't agree with you. And the nice thing here is that within the Jewish system, because we are not just a religion, this is a terrible definition of religion, but we're not just a faith community, because you can be a Jew without any faith at all, for that matter. You can be an atheist Jew, because we're a people, like Americans are a people, or Canadians are a people, or Kenyans are a people. They can't throw you out, right? So you can disagree and disagree and disagree, but at the end of the day, you're all still Jews, so you can hold these multiple interpretations, right? What happens in the church is those multiple interpretations are foreclosed. Why? Because if you get into a system by belief, you're going to get out by belief. So Christians didn't want to argue that much. It means this, and that's the end of it. So in that sense, the revelation in the church somewhat gets shut down.
And going back to the book, and we wrote it several years ago, so I'm not quite sure exactly how we use the term. But I think what we were also trying to refer to is the fact that in some cases, already in the Tanakh itself, there is a notion that a text is opaque and needs to be interpreted. And it is only through divine revelation that the true meaning, or a true meaning of the text, is going to come through. So a classic example from that is in one of the latest books of the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, latest in terms of the chronology of the book, not in terms of the order. And that's from the book of Daniel, where in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel is looking carefully in the books about the number of years, according to the word of the Lord to the prophet Jeremiah, must be fulfilled for the devastation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So just to offer some background there, Jeremiah twice, but it's most important, most prominent in Jeremiah chapter 25, talks about Babylonian world domination for 70 years. And after 70 years, everything is going to be hunky-dory for the Jews who are going to return. Well, by the time that Daniel was written, things were very far from wonderful for the Jewish community. So the author of Daniel had to figure out, how are we going to reinterpret these 70 years so that the words of the prophet Jeremiah can still be true? There is a reinterpretation. I won't go into it. We talk about this a little in the book, where somehow 70 becomes 490, 70 times 7. But the important piece that I'd like to emphasize is Daniel did not figure this out by himself. If you go to that chapter and you continue in verse 21, after Daniel prayed for a long time, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen before in a vision, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. And then Gabriel explains to Daniel that 70 really means 490. So this notion that you have that texts are very complicated, that they don't necessarily mean what they seem to mean, and that only through some sort of revelation, whether in the Jewish tradition, it's understood in one way as an oral Torah going all the way back to Sinai. In the Christian tradition, this is understood differently. Only through some sort of revelation does the full meaning of the text become evident. And just again, because I talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls earlier, this is not a uniquely Christian notion. This, again, is something that is shared very much by Judaism in the period. You see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where you have this remarkable sentence in a type of commentary called Pesher on the book of the minor or short prophets called Habakkuk, which says that the prophet himself did not really understand the full meaning of what he was saying. And only when the teacher of righteousness, who is often understood to be the founder or a founder of the Dead Sea Scroll community, only to him was it revealed what the prophet really meant. And that's a totally remarkable notion, which is, I think, very helpful for both religions to understand and appreciate, because in both cases, very often, each religious tradition does not take what the text means in a straightforward fashion. Again, we're back to your college paper, but rather understands it in a very different fashion. And in some cases, the notion really developed out, this is such an unusual way of interpreting the text. Surely this was revealed somehow to somebody later in the tradition.
Well, just to add to that, so many people have this experience today. They just don't talk. I mean, some of them do talk about divine revelation, but you just say to a student who's struggling with a paper, go home and think about it. And the next morning is, I got it. You know, I might have had a dream about it. I might have been having, you know, my evening glass of decaf coffee, and suddenly there it was. That's in fact how academics sort of do this as well. We look at a text and we look at a text and we try to come up with something new. And suddenly, in what can only be described as inspiration, right? Because that's what it is. Oh, it's this. So we can actually take that model and give it to non-theologically oriented students. Say, this is kind of an anthropological thing. If you think about something and you open up your imagination and you do the background work, so you got everything there, eventually you might be able to put this together in a new way and come up with a new reading that actually works. And the test case is, does anybody else get your reading? Yeah. So the better question in the classroom is not, did this happen historically, right? But how do you know that? What's your evidence? And if you say, oh, you know, an angel revealed it to me, that's not going to cut it in my classroom. But if you say, well, you know, because the Hebrew can be interpreted this way and the same word is used over here, now you've got a good argument. But I think that kind of revelation does continue. We just don't use the same language, except in fundamentalist churches where God speaks to the pastor the night before.
Right.
And the last time a student of mine footnoted Gabriel, that student did not do especially well.
When my students tell me that, you know, they got the information, you know, the Holy Spirit will tell them what to say, Like, I don't really need to take a Bible class because when I'm in the pulpit, I open up the text and the Holy Spirit tells me what to say. My sense is give the Spirit something to work with.
Right.
Like, go to the library, do a
I-
little bit of background reading.
AJ, I have a question kind of related to this sense of revelatory exegesis, like that this, like thinking about the book of Psalms, which is very important in the Christian, certainly very important in my tradition, the Anglican tradition. Our prayer book always has all of the Psalter, every bit of it from beginning to end. But how that gets used, or it has sort of an original context, but then it even shifts genre, maybe, or how. Like,
This would be a better question for Mark because Mark's the Psalms expert.
okay.
So I'd say a few things. I mean, first of all, within Judaism, Psalms is also incredibly important. And if you want to talk about font size, going back to your earlier question, something that is really quite remarkable is that in terms of each of the three sections of the Jewish canon, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, Judaism, Christianity, and the Dead Sea Scroll community all saw the same book as most important: Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and Psalms.
Wow.
So Psalms was a big one. In Judaism, Psalms are the predominant part, for example, of the Friday night service. If you get there early enough in synagogue, every morning, the end of Psalms is recited every day. Psalm 145 is recited in each of the three Jewish prayers. So it's incredibly important. I think one important difference is if you look at the way in which Psalms is quoted in the New Testament, Psalms is predominantly understood as a prophetic book,
Right.
specifically as a prophetic book in relation to Jesus. Neither of those is true in classical Jewish interpretation in the rabbinic period, although in later periods, some of the medieval Jewish commentators really did understand Psalms, not so much as a book of prayer, but as a book of prophecy. And finally, I would say, since you used the term recontextualization, if I remember your question properly, it is striking that Jewish tradition also recontextualizes Psalms. And this really starts already in what most biblical scholars would claim is the secondary introduction to the book of Psalms, namely Psalm 1, which talks about Psalms as Torah, because the Psalter has 5 parts, just like the Torah or Pentateuch has 4 parts. And it is a book that has to be studied. So the recontextualization, that's a hard word, in Judaism is from prayer to something that you study and meditate on and recite. And by the way, living in Jerusalem now, you actually see this on the buses, where the more religious people, rather than checking the score of the game on their iPhones, they're reciting the book of Psalms, either from their phones or from a real physical book. But that is a way of just reciting Psalms, not necessarily praying them. While the Christian recontextualization is different, namely, instead of going from prayer to something that you study, goes from prayer to prophecy.
That's really interesting. Something else that changes meaning, I like that idea, the genre change, or taking the book out of one subject matter in the library, moving it to another part of the library. But something very basic about biblical texts that people understand it when you point it out, but most American people don't think about it a lot is with punctuation. And so I can remember, AJ, a moment in Charles Talbert's class where he pulled out what he thought was this neat party trick, and where he thought it worked with the Revised Standard Version. I'm sure it was an epistle. And he said that, look at these 2 sentences. Now move the period, whatever, 3 words one way or the other, and now read it. And everyone was like, what? What's going on here? Because it would change what looked like the meaning, or just to use something that would be familiar to me, in Paul's letters, like, gosh, quotation marks would really be helpful. Are these his words, or are these the words of the people he really thinks aren't great? Or who is saying what? It would be helpful to have quotation marks. But can you talk about, talk about how punctuation, like, it's not there, right?
No, it's not there, and it won't be invented till centuries after we have our text. Since we're coming up on Advent, the easiest one to look at is Isaiah 40, which gets redeployed all over the place, including by the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is the so-called second Isaiah, writing Babylonian exile, more or less, who says, in effect, and this is part of that Jeremiah thing that Mark was talking about earlier, this, like, 70 years. Okay, so it wasn't quite 70. Your exile was over. So Isaiah says, a voice cries out, punctuate, comma, quotation mark, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, build a highway for our God, right? Make the mountains come down and the valleys will be lifted up. In other words, go out to the desert and do some road construction, because you're going to be walking back from Babylon back to the land of Israel. So a voice cries out, comma, quotation mark, in the wilderness, do all this stuff. When you get to Mark, which is the first gospel, where there is no Christmas story, it's the preaching of John the Baptist. Mark explains that John the Baptist is, in effect, this fulfillment of the Isaiah prophecy. He is a voice crying out in the wilderness. So we have just taken in the wilderness and moved it from one side of the comma to the other side of the comma. So for Mark, a voice cries out in the wilderness, comma, quotation mark, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And adding to that, because words always change meaning depending upon context and over time, when Isaiah's audience heard prepare the way of the Lord, and Lord here is the tetragrammaton YHWH, it was God. But because Jesus gets identified in Greek as Kurios, Lord, when Christian readers are reading the Gospel of Mark and they hear the preaching of John the Baptist is preparing the way of the Lord, they're hearing the way of Jesus. So that's another shift, and making it even more shifty. I meant that in a positive way. The word for way is hodos. It's where we get the word odometer. It's your mileage indicator. And according to the book of Acts, the early followers of Jesus do not call themselves Christians. In fact, Paul never uses the term. Of course, neither does Jesus. They call themselves followers of the way. So not only has Mark changed the punctuation, a voice crying out in the wilderness, i.e. John the Baptist out by the Jordan, but the way is now the Christian way, the hodos, and the Lord is Jesus. So we've had a change of punctuation, and we've also had changes to words in terms of connotation. And you could do this. You could turn a statement into a question, because there are no question marks. There are sigla for questions, but you don't have to have them. You can run on a sentence. You can inflect differently, so that even if we did have punctuation, we still don't know the tone. Is somebody being facetious or cajoling or celebratory? And the ancient world allowed that various type of play, punctuation, tone, reconnoting, providing new context for material. Happens all the time.
Great. Were you going to say something, Mark?
Yeah, let me add an example of just of where a question mark makes such a huge difference. I just need to find it. There we go. Psalm 116, verse 15. Again, I'll read the NRSV, which has a period here. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful ones. Is that a statement, which is how the NRSV takes it? Or given that as in Hebrew, as in English, often questions are marked by intonation. Should we read this? Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful ones, as a rhetorical question. I mean, that makes a huge difference. And had I known this was going to come up, I would have worn, I have a favorite t-shirt for this that I sometimes wear for class. And it has two different renditions of Don't Eat Grandma, right? Where one is Don't Eat, comma, Grandma, as opposed to Don't Eat Grandma. So commas could be a matter of life and death.
And the way that example you used, the second version with the question mark sounds like it could actually be my prayer. Whereas the first way with the period doesn't sound like a prayer, but I could easily imagine the second version, me crying out, what's going on?
Yeah, that's certainly how I understand it.
Yeah, you can do the same thing with the New Testament. In the healing of the centurion's servant or slave or son in Matthew chapter 8, the centurion meets Jesus directly. In Luke, they have intermediaries. And the centurion says, in effect, I've got this precious slave who's paralyzed at home, come do something. And most English translations have Jesus say, I will come and heal him. Right. And then the centurion says, I'm not worthy, and, blah, blah, blah. Well, it makes more sense to read it as a question. You want me to heal him? Right. My mission is to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. You're a centurion. You work for the occupation government. You want me to heal him? Are you nuts? Which then better explains oh, no, I'm under authority too. And, just say the word and everything will be all well and good. So if you read it as a question, you can then see that shifting around. Both readings are legitimate. There is no punctuation there. But how you understand what the gospel is conveying, how you understand the historical Jesus may make a difference in terms of what kind of intonation you give words attributed to him.
That's really great. Thank you for that. And I want to ask you a little bit for advice here, a little bit, because, early when I was a young priest, I remember once being invited to give a sermon at a community. I was told it was a community ecumenical Thanksgiving service, so the eve of Thanksgiving Day, and I thought, okay, great, I have my sermon here. I arrive at a Presbyterian church, and we're all dressed up in our different traditions and all, and I'm told in the narthex that it's an interfaith service, not an ecumenical service, which those words have different meanings to me. And I thought, well, that would have been nice to know.
Yeah.
But I thought, well, what am I going to do? Well, the sermon I have is the sermon I have, and I'll just have to do a little fancy footwork in how I introduce things or from what perspective I speak. And I think about, through the years of being a priest, I've often found myself, sometimes what gets billed as an interfaith service or some of the worst experiences I ever have, because there's a tendency in liberal Protestant Christianity to water everything down. So we're going to pretend to be Unitarians for an hour, which feels like it's only honoring the Unitarians and dishonoring many other people in the room. Versus my most wonderful experience of this was when I was an associate rector at Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, Virginia, and the inauguration of Tim Kaine as the governor was moved to Williamsburg, kind of like a retro inauguration because of renovations that were being done on the state capitol. And he wanted there to be an interfaith prayer service before the inauguration. So I was in charge of putting that together. And he had individuals important in his life whom he knew and trusted to be, like a Jewish representative, a Muslim representative. There was a Roman Catholic person. He was Roman Catholic. And I had to make this decision. What is this going to look like? And the decision that was made was, I'm not scripting this for everybody, their prayers. I'm inviting them, we each had a topic to pray about, and you pray about this topic in your voice so that you bring your full self into the service. And actually someone who was a senator came out after, he said, I've been to a lot of services like that, but that felt right to me. And this idea that we bring our full selves or our true voice into the room, it makes a lot of people nervous, or they don't know what to do with it. And I feel like the conversations we're having can kind of help people be themselves. You can't have a real conversation in a room if you're not yourself.
Yeah, well, because you don't sacrifice the particulars of your religious tradition on the altar of interfaith sensitivity. That doesn't get you anywhere. The question is, if you have some sort of invocation, in what sense are you going to limit?
Right.
So what I advise my students is, do not say, as we pray in the name of Jesus, because then you're going to eliminate, your Muslims and your Jews and pretty much everybody else. But you can say, as I pray in the name of Jesus, and we address God in many different names and many different ways, right? That works because then you're being true to yourself and you're not forcing everybody else to amen your particular more parochial view of doing things. I'm in churches a lot,
Right.
and very often they'll kind of pull all the Christian punches, which is kind of stupid because, you know, I'm in a church and there's a big cross there. So we'll make it like palatable for AJ. And I think that's dumb. Because if you came into my synagogue, we're not going to throw in references to Jesus and Mary to make you feel at home. So I think people ought to be, as you suggested, authentically them and speak out of their tradition. But if they are going to involve the people there in their material, so they're no longer speaking as they're speaking as we, then you have to be more careful.
Right.
But if you stay on the that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Totally on the same page.
Well, I will note, by the way, that at the end of your book, The Bible With and Without Jesus, it is interesting that you reference the Isaiah passage that will be read in my church on this coming Sunday, the image of the peaceable kingdom at the end of that passage. And of course, you note that we don't experience that right now, that there's something unfulfilled in both of the ways that our traditions read the big story, and we're both waiting for something that is not yet. And I thought that was really interesting as I thought about preparing myself to step into the pulpit on the second Sunday of Advent. But I really like that your use of that image at the end of your book, and that you ended. This is something that's hopeful, kind of like when you talk about the ambiguity of language or something like that. That this is something that's interesting and inviting. Not you could look at it as a problem, or you can look at it as an invitation.
Or a problem is an invitation.
A problem is an invitation.
See that little itch, and
a good kind of problem. Yeah, a good problem.
And then you invent a new self. I mean, Judaism and Christianity are both unfinished products. So Jews traditionally are waiting for the Messiah to come. Christians are waiting for the Messiah to come back. And since we've got very little control over that, then we can figure out, so what do we do in the interim, right? And how do we move closer to that peaceable kingdom that both traditions seem to want very much? And instead of sticking our heads in the sand and saying, well, we'll just let God take care of it. Both traditions are very clear that you have to work with, you have to work toward, you have to do something. And what the calendar can do is kind of spark you. Oh, this is Advent. Oh, it's like New Year's. You start you get your resolution. What exactly am I working toward? What do I want to see happen? And how can I participate in bringing that about? And it's a lovely opportunity.
I think
and I just say that,
Mark,
go ahead, Mark, finish up, and then I'll round this out.
Yeah, that in the same way that two people can wait together in the same place, going to different destinations, I mean, two communities could wait together and can support each other, even though they have different understandings of what they're waiting for.
That's beautiful.
That is beautiful. And I think a great place to conclude this conversation, but the good work continues after we leave from this. And so thank you all for being a part of this conversation. To those of you watching this conversation, thank you for joining in. I encourage you to please check out their other publications along with the Bible With and Without Jesus. This is the book. And so do add this to your library. And thank you both again for the time and coming to us from so many different locations. This is a beautiful thing.
Always a pleasure to talk with you.
Definitely.
Merry Christmas.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Thank you. And do not eat grandma. So I think that's really important. So